Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. How are you this morning, Kieran?
Okay, suffering from last match on match of the day-itis, but if anybody saw Brighton versus Burnley yesterday, they probably know why.
Well, yeah, you're suffering from last match on match of the day-itis. We're suffering from why can't we have better referees in English football? Itis. We're on the side of referees on this show, Kieran, but every now and again you have to acknowledge that some referees do not apply the rules equally to both teams playing in the game at the same time. Really, Virgil van Dijk is the worst referee we've had at Palace for a long time. He's good at pointing, but if only there was somebody else on the pitch who had a whistle who could perhaps have made decisions, what a better game that would have been. That's going to come up with this. It's going to come up with it again. And as for you not beating Burnley, Kieran, you were getting the blame for that in the pub afterwards.
Well, 29 shots, but their keeper had an absolute blinder. Fair play to him. He was magnificent.
Yeah, I also think Vincent Kompany does a splendid job of looking like he's won every game, whatever happens. When the final whistle goes, he just puts that proper smile on for the camera. It's questions day, Kieran. First question is, why can't we have better referees in the Premier League? The first question, Kieran, comes from Ben Robinson. And Ben Robinson, you notice how I go from my angry voice into my smooth broadcasting voice here, Kieran? Very good, isn't it? There's a job for Classic FM. I'd love to do Classic FM. Imagine that. I wonder if Classic FM would find a space for the Price of Football podcast, Kieran. It's unlikely, I imagine. And if they did, they'd get Alexander Armstrong to host it, like he appears to be hosting every single thing on radio at the moment. Ben Robinson says, do transfer deal add-ons like sell-on fees expire after a certain number of years? Are they only valid for the initial contract that the player signs when they join a club? Or do they stay in place for the length of time that a player stays there? Good question, Kieran.
It is. I spoke to one of our legal friends on this, and the answer was, of course, it depends, as one would expect. In order to protect the selling club, they will have contractual obligations which will normally last an agreed period of time. That's to stop the buying club renegotiating the contract with the player after, say, 6 months, giving the player a small pay rise and effectively writing out the selling club from all of the add-ons. So under normal circumstances, it would be for the original period of the contract. Now, if the original period of the contract is for 5 years, even if the player renegotiates his or her contract during that period of time, the selling club will still have been protected in terms of international caps, winning trophies, and so on. So it's all there to protect all of the individual parties committed to the contract.
You'll be intrigued to know, Kieran, I think, apropos our conversation about referees at the start of the show, that I have my own secret broadcaster. I didn't know I had him until he contacted me after the game yesterday. Is somebody I'd met who found themselves working for a broadcasting company, which gave them access to the VAR conversations yesterday. And he said that the VAR official was literally pleading for the ref to go and check that we'd had a penalty. Literally pleading when the ref going, no, it's fine, I don't think so. Obviously, I don't imagine that would be Liverpool would fail. And eventually, the VAR official said, Howard Webb's in the building. And that was the cue for him to go and check whether or not it was a penalty. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But the bloke told me in the pub afterwards, so I've got no reason to disbelieve it.
If it comes from a bloke in a pub, it's got to be true.
Absolutely. He was a very credible bloke in the pub, I have to say. And, he turned up into the pub quite late, so obviously he had been working. That's clearly the only reason he wouldn't have got to the pub till 10 to 5. Adam Roper has our next question. They're all good questions this week, but this is another interesting one. Adam says, one of the topics I find most interesting on the pod is that of the employment status of footballers, as I suppose I always thought of them just as sportsmen and never really considered them having a normal employer-employee relationship. But this makes me wonder about the employment relationship of a player that's on loan to another club. On financial matters, for example, which club actually pays the player if the cost is split between clubs? Which club receives compensation if the player is injured playing international football? And would the individual bonuses/incentives still hold if the player, for example, scores 100 goals at the loaning club?
I spoke to the secret agent this morning, or one of the secret agents. We are very fortunate that we have quite a few of these days.
Yeah. Should we have do you want a drum roll before you say it depends this time, Kieran?
And you're absolutely right. But he gave me a very comprehensive answer. He said, if it's a domestic deal, so if we've got a player, say, going from Palace to Millwall, or Brighton to Portsmouth, or whatever it's going to be, then the selling club, the parent club, is responsible for paying the wages.
Right.
But when it comes to bonuses, the buying club is responsible for the bonuses, which makes sense. As far as the selling club is concerned, they normally pay the player and then they invoice the buying club for saying, well, if you've got Joe Bloggs for the 6 months, we've agreed, you're paying 80% of his wages, and therefore here's a bill for 80% of his wages. On some occasions, however, the buying club will be paying wages that are higher than that of the selling club. So if we take the case of Kylian Mbappe, remember he went initially on loan to PSG. So they paid him the top up, and that makes a lot of sense. So it's the more you go into it, the more complicated it becomes. And then we move to the issue of international loans. So if you've got a player going from the Premier League to the Bundesliga, or from La Liga to Serie A, then it is the buying player who is responsible for paying the player. And that makes a lot of sense because you've got different tax systems. If I'm being employed in Germany, then I need to be subject to German tax rules, even though my parent club could be Liverpool or Brighton or Palace or wherever it's going to be. So it does open up a pretty much can full of worms. But the contracts are there once again to protect all parties, but also to ensure compliance with sort of local tax rules. And the more you go into it, the more complex it becomes.
Speaking of Joe Bloggs, Kieran, our next question comes from Jojo Boys. Unusually, though, the Joe in this scenario is spelt with an E, so it's Joe Boys. Now, it's so unusual that I do wonder whether Guy hiccuped as he was emailing us the question, or whether, in fact, Jojo Boys is Jojo Boys. It's both circumstances are interesting, Kieran. I'm always fascinated when I come across a name I've never seen before. But Jojo has a simple but again interesting question. Jojo says, are footballers' pensions just the same as in most workplaces? And is there any preference amongst clubs for defined benefits over defined contributions? Now, you might have to define what defined benefits and defined contributions are, Kieran, before we get on with the rest of the question.
Yes. So a defined benefit pension scheme is often referred to as a final salary scheme. And the way that it works is for every year, for example, let's say for every year that you've been employed by your current employer, you get 1.5% of your final salary, or 1.5% of the average of your last 5 years' salary, or whatever it's going to be. So if I've worked for the organisation for 20 years and I'm on 1.5% per year, 20 times 1.5, I get 30% of my final salary upon retirement. That is good for employers when the stock market is doing well, because pension funds are invested in the stock market and you get loads of money. It could be that you're quitting. But if the stock market's not doing well, lots of employers have got caught on the hoof because the returns that they've got from investing the money have been crap, and then the employer has to make up the shortfall. So what we have seen in many pension funds over the years is a switch away from that because the employers don't want to take on that risk. And now we have something which is far more common, which is called the defined contribution fund scheme. And a defined contribution scheme is you put 10% of your salary into a pension scheme each month. That's managed for you by a pension specialist, and you keep your fingers crossed that they're not an idiot, i.e. that they've invested your money well. Right. So all of the risk is borne by you as the employee. So whilst people say to me, well, why? Yeah, you talk about finance. Yeah, how does it impact upon me? Well, these days, probably about certainly over 90% of private sector employees have defined contribution schemes. So if you're getting good returns in terms of dividends, in terms of interest, in terms of increases in share prices, then that's going to affect you when you retire. So what we have seen as far as football is concerned is that it used to have a defined benefit scheme, but that started to run up a pretty significant deficit. So most of the clubs have now bailed out of this central scheme in football, and they've switched to sort of standard defined contribution schemes, which are quite portable. And if you think about it from the point of view of a professional footballer, they could be playing for a significant number of clubs. So you move from pension scheme to pension scheme as you change employer.
At any given social situation that Ali and I find ourselves in, she spends a lot of time with her fingers crossed, hoping that I'm not being an idiot. So she's going to get arthritis of the finger at some stage. And this is the last time I shall crow by this in, Kieran, but Saturday's referee, was very much do not fine. There you go. That's the opposite of define. He was do not fine. I really hope Howard Webb listens to this and just gets hold of my number and sends me an angry email so I can send him one back. Leslie Ackley.
We have asked PGMOL to come on the show and they've declined. So.
Of course, they've declined. Rick Parry and PGMOL are. If you define decline, you pretty much look up the word decline in the dictionary and you'll see a picture of Rick Parry and PGMOL, because they are the people who most often turn down our kind offer to come on to our pod and have a... I can't understand why, Kieran. I mean, I know you saw Rick Parry the other night at that vastly unfair awards ceremony that I wasn't invited to, and I know you did the...
You were invited.
I was invited to pay...
I
was invited to pay 65 quid to come along, Kieran. You were invited +1, which means the Barrett...
No, you were my +1. She drank more than £65 worth of booze.
Well, that's if you're putting that down as a challenge, Kieran, then I will happily. Oh, actually, I'm not sure I would take the Baroness on that. I was not down as your +1, Kieran. You had a +1, and quite wisely, in any situation where you're offered a +1, you turn to the Baroness first, because I wouldn't like to see the look on the Baroness's face when you went, well, it was +1, so I've asked Kev to come along. But regardless, I could have come along for a mere £65. But regardless, you and Rick Parry, I understand you did the Simpsons pointing at the eyes and pointing at each other thing. That's why I understand why Rick Parry won't come on. Why PGMOL won't come on, I don't know. If Howard Webb's listening, come on. We'd love to see you on the pod. Give your head a little polish. Be lovely to see you. Leslie Ackley, I can't remember why we started. Guess. Leslie Ackley, which is a great name. Leslie, that's a proper 60s film. That would be a detective sergeant, wouldn't it, in a 60s film, played by Leslie Ackley. Leslie's question, I think, is a really interesting one. Leslie says, I understand that when Ken Bates owned Chelsea FC, he sold even small areas of the pitch to Chelsea fans in the hope of preventing the club being forced to move from Stamford Bridge in future, which we know is true, Kieran, because we've interviewed one of the heads of the Chelsea Pitch Owners Association. It's probably the wisest thing that Ken Bates did. And we've spoken about that scheme, especially when Burley took over, about whether he knew about it or not is a moot point. But Leslie's question, this is the interesting bit, says, I wonder when the owners of these small sections of the pitch shuffle off this mortal coil, which is a lovely euphemism, so when they die, whether these assets can be passed on in a will, etc., to family members or friends who also support the club, or do these portions of the pitch then revert to the control of the club? Which it suggests a wider question, Kieran, that we didn't ask, or I certainly didn't ask, is that could individual members of the Chelsea Pitch Association, regardless of whether they leave the bit of the pitch in their will, could they, while they're still alive, offer to sell their bit of the pitch back to the club, and eventually the whole pitch could be part of the club, and then that might help with redevelopment of the ground?
I think that would take quite a long time.
Yeah.
And whilst we're on the subject, the debut album by this Mortal Coil is one of my favourites from the 80s, featuring both the Cocteau Twins and Felt. That's on the day when I had a sort of the long coat and the floppy fringe. I was trying to be as 80s as I could.
I don't think it gets more 80s than the sentence featuring the Cocteau Twins and Felt.
Yes.
That's going to be. I'm going to be saying that all day. Every time Ali says, "You want a cup of tea?" Yes, as long as it's featuring the Cocteau Twins.
And again, I absolutely reiterate your view that this was a fantastic piece of work by Ken Bates, which is not a thing I'd ever say under normal circumstances. And for those people not familiar, what has happened, as Leslie has indicated, is that the pitch has been effectively cut into 1 yard or 1 metre squares, and it's been sold off to individuals, and you can't own more than 10. So there's very much a protection of the club, because it was one of the things that he feared in respect of new owners coming in. It will form part of the estate in respect of anybody who sadly passes away, and therefore it will be down to the recipients of the estate to determine the appropriate action. But even if it was sold back to the club wouldn't be able to have more than 10 votes. So I think there would still be some form of protection, and I would imagine that many Chelsea fans who have a huge affection for Stamford Bridge and want what's best, they wouldn't feel comfortable about transferring decision making wholly in respect of where the club play to an American investment fund and Todd Bowley, of whom we have many stories, none of which we can repeat on the show.
Well, if you come and see us live, Kieran could be cajoled into doing so. How significant, Kieran, is the Chelsea Pitch Owners Association? If there was a significant attempt by a developer to buy Stamford Bridge, with a sum that involved billions of pounds, would the Chelsea Pitch Owners Association really be able to prevent that from happening?
Yes, they own the name Chelsea Football Club, so they have huge influence in terms of protecting the future of the club. So if somebody, there was talk about moving to Battersea Power Station, there was talk about taking over from Earl's Court. Chelsea, under Clear Lake Capital, have now bought, as we said, a piece of land next to the ground. Is that going to be used to development? Possibly. Or, bigger picture, could it be sold as an even bigger, piece of real estate in the swankiest part of London, and therefore be worth an absolute fortune in its own right? But in order to do that, you'd have to get the CPO approval. So it's a bit like the Bank of England in the sense that they are a protector of last resort. They don't get involved in the day-to-day decision making. They don't get involved in funding. But in terms of which surely is the most iconic part of Chelsea, its stadium, they are its protectors, its guardians.
I would love to have seen Chelsea play at Battersea Power Station. Anything would be preferable than what they've done to it now. Do you know how long it was a power station for, Kieran?
I don't.
It's 19 years. That's all. Really? Yeah. It's one of the most iconic buildings in London, and it was only built in 1951, and I think it was decommissioned in 1970, and then just allowed.
A lot of dash hounds as well.
Dash hounds?
Because I went there. The Baroness wanted to go there to look at the shops, and as you can imagine,
of course,
and people wonder why we hate international weekends.
Yeah,
because this is a classic. As soon as I work out the international weekends, and I go, oh Jesus Christ, what am I going? I know what's going to happen. So we went up there because we hadn't been there before, and it was incredibly antiseptic.
Yeah,
It was
it is.
just. I hate shopping. I hate crowds unless it's at a football match because you are part of a living organism when you're part of a crowd at a football match. But I don't like groups of people, and it was horrendous. But yet, so many of them were wandering around carrying dash hounds,
Oh,
and it was all sort of swanky bankers and horrible, horrible. Make
well,
it a football
that's
ground.
yeah. Well, that's see, unlike the rest of us. That shows how upper class they are, Kieran. Because it'd be cockapoos if they were middle class. Or that seems to be the indicator of being middle class these days. Having a cockapoo called Daisy, but they've all got dash hounds, and the dash hounds are too posh to even walk, being carried around. Brian Markovitz has our next quote. We're being easily distracted today, Kieran, are we not? Distracted away from that BAFTA nomination yet again. Brian Markovitz says, earlier this year, the US Soccer Federation released its financial statements and tax forms, including salaries for all federation officials and coaches. Is this something that's done in other countries, or is this information publicly available elsewhere? And how do some of the coaching salaries compare to other countries? I found this question very interesting, Kieran. Especially why the US Soccer Federation saw the need to publish this information in the first place.
Yeah, the US is a complex, chaotic country in so many ways. We've just seen. We're recording this on Sunday morning, but I think yesterday afternoon came news through of a baseball player signing a $300 million contract. We talk about money in football, but compared to some of the US sports, it pales into insignificance. And American soccer clubs and NFL clubs and basketball clubs, they are private companies, and private companies don't have the same obligations as private companies have here in the UK in terms of submitting data to Companies House. Because otherwise, no disrespect to us, producer guy would be running the price of NFL because to a far bigger audience, and we would be out on our ear. Because there'd be a huge audience for it, but there's simply not enough financial data to run that particular show. So they seem they've got a far more blasé attitude towards money. We're always very protective about how much we earn. I think it's part of the British national sort of the reserve. We don't want to be seen to be posting about things in America. This is how much I earn. It's part of the American dream. So in the case of the US national men's team, the coach earns $1.64 million, which is probably about £1.4 million. But the US women's national team, which has been far more successful, the coach earns $446,000. So the men's coach is on about 3.5 times the amount of the women's coach. If we take a look at England, the Football Association does not publish data. So therefore, of course, we have to go to journalists' gossip, which is great if you're in one of those WhatsApp groups. And the word on the street is that Gareth Southgate is probably on around about £5 million a year plus bonus. Where does that place him? From international managers, it's certainly at the top end. As far as club managers are concerned, that's sort of probably mid tier as far as the Premier League is concerned. Serena Wiegman is on estimated £400,000. So, it's less than a tenth of that of Gareth Southgate. There's an article in The Guardian, it would be The Guardian, of course, where else, saying, well, surely they should be paid the same. And, there's a debate to be had, which isn't for here. We'll leave that. We'll leave that to somebody with far more common sense than us to discuss that. Someone like Joey Barton, he knows. he can put his finger on the pulse. In terms of
I was going to ask you, Kieran, who could have more common sense than us? But then, of course, you suggested the other. Yeah, oddly enough, his name came up in the Parsons Arms before the game yesterday.
Yes.
And the conversation started by two of the female members of our group. Would you believe it, Kieran?
Yeah, I know. It's amazing what people will do when they've got a new podcast to promote to try to get an audience, isn't it?
We didn't do that, Kieran. We just
we sort of
apologetically banged on about amortisation for a couple of weeks.
Yes.
It's the only way we plug this podcast. I can understand why, Kieran, the FA. I think somebody's earnings are a very personal matter, and of course they are. But as we learned when we were researching the book, the FA are incredibly cagey about revealing any financial information, from salaries down to how much players are offered to play for England. Which they always say it doesn't matter because the players give the money away. But I understand why they're so reluctant to reveal details. But it does stand in stark contrast to the Americans, who are just literally quite happy to say, no, this is what everyone earns, and this is what the amount of tax they're paying on that money.
Yeah, it's very much a cultural difference. At the awards ceremony on Monday, I did bump into somebody from the FA, and I was trying to do a little bit of gentle arm twisting to get them to come on to talk about sort of the role of the FA from a financial point of view. We're not going to talk about the England team. We're not going to talk about individual salaries because ultimately, as you rightly say, it's a private concern. A bit of progress was made, but I got the impression that it wasn't the same as a complete commitment from them. So I suspect they'll say, anything that happens after 3 or 4 glasses of Pinot Grigio is by definition not contractually an obligation.
You should have got the Baroness to do the discussing, Kieran. The Baroness could persuade anyone to appear on anyone.
Well, yeah, she did. She did actually, because she got somebody. She was sitting next to somebody from Network Rail.
What?
And she had a sort of an hour-long conversation with him. And actually, this is somebody who we should get on the show, because he was talking about match day travel.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the stuff that goes on was pretty fascinating. So I'll try and get hold of him. He's got the Baroness's number. She's not got his. It was a bit like Jersey, that Leeds fan.
Just as a matter of interest, Kieran, do you think was this person from Network Rail nominated for an award at this dinner? Do you think, or just there on a jolly on expenses? Because either way, I'm even more annoyed now that some bloke from Network Rail was invited and I wasn't, and I was nominated. Something's gone wrong, and it's terribly wrong. What a world we live in, Kieran. It's shocking, isn't it? Paul Salvin has a very interesting question, and it's the sort of question I like, because I'm fairly certain this would have come out of a pub conversation, and they're nearly always the best questions. And Paul says, I often hear on your pod about player transfers being paid in instalments, and I had a thought, ... That's always it always gets the juices flowing when you see that ... And Paul says, we all know transfer fees are becoming ridiculously high as a result of being able to buy now and pay later. But if clubs were forced to pay for players in full when they bought them, I think transfer fees would likely come down, as clubs never want to just buy one player every summer, and it would stop the issue of potential non-payment. It would also stop clubs getting promoted and then buying 20-plus players, I suppose, as Forest would be an example, and it would give the lads who got them promoted a chance to perform. Can you see any pitfalls to this question? I actually think that's a really good concept. If all transfers had to be paid in cash, I think Paul's absolutely right. Transfer fees would plummet, wouldn't they?
This is something which I've suggested to, best described as the powers, and it was an interesting response. They said they think it would result in a softening of some transfer fees, but I think the concern would be is that some of the existing gaps in football could be widened. If you are funded by a sovereign wealth fund, if you are funded by a gazillionaire, then they can afford to pay everything. And sort of a mid-tier club who's just been promoted or has been, again, we look at Palace and Brighton. We got into the Premier League. We both signed a few players. some of them were signed for cash, but mainly on instalments. That step up is, you budget. Well, we hope we're going to be in the Premier League for a couple of seasons, and you budget accordingly. And I think the danger is that it could actually amplify the gaps between those clubs which are funded, by want of a better phrase, by sugar daddies, and those which are sort of more sort of collectively funded, and also could increase the extent of the yo-yo within the Premier League and Championship in terms of recycling. Because you've got a club like Sheffield United or Forest. Forest were promoted last season. Yes, they signed 20 players, but part of the reason for their ability to do that was that they were able to take advantage of the credit facilities available. And if you introduce that in UK football and you don't have that within European football, it would put the Premier League and EFL clubs at a disadvantage to other clubs. So, I thought it was a valid point, and I've certainly discussed it with more senior people. So, I absolutely understand where Paul is coming from. Would it result in an overall reduction of transfer fees? I think the answer is probably yes, but the unforeseen consequences could actually be negative as well.
I do like Paul's romantic notion as well about the lads who get a team promoted, or the girls who get a team promoted, getting a chance to perform in the Premier League or the WSL. As I've always argued, that the very first game a club plays in the Premier League, the team should be the same that played in the last game of the Championship or played in the playoff final. Just even so a player can get one chance to play in the Premier League, and then you can bring in all the newcomers. It's not going to happen, of course, because it means your team is likely to lose 3 points. But I do think I always think it's really unfair when a player gets a team promoted or helps get a team promoted and then gets a transfer back to the Championship. Nick Brace has our next question. And Nick Brace says, as someone who comes from the small town of Gosport, I like to keep up with the fortunes of the local club, Gosport Borough FC. I've recently noticed that they have their highlights on YouTube using VEO cameras to record the matches. Could this technology help smaller clubs get a foothold into areas such as YouTube? And can this technology improve enough to help smaller clubs be able to offer their own streaming packages in the future at an affordable cost for them? Now, Kieran, you know this. The wider audience don't know. My knowledge of technology equals my knowledge of amortization. So I'm not entirely sure what a VEO camera is, but it sounds impressive.
Yeah, it's effectively, it can be controlled remotely. So
Ooh.
you can have somebody in a central box and they can follow the action. Well, Nick, I think theoretically this could be beneficial, but you then have to say, good luck to Gosport Borough FC. We're a huge fan of local football. How many views are you going to get on the back of that? So I actually went onto YouTube and I took a look at one of Gosport's recent matches. They had 700 views of the YouTube video. So it's not going to generate much money. We now have a YouTube channel ourselves on the price of football, and we probably get 400 to 500 views of some of the videos that producer guys put up, and I've done some charts and so on, which we and it's not generating an awful lot of traffic, but it's something we're going to continue to do. So some of our chats, with the producer guy, are cut into segments just to sort of publicise the show, and we've done a few other financial bits and pieces as well. But it's not generated a lot of traction, and unless you're getting hundreds of thousands of views, you're really not getting a significant financial return, because YouTube's a bit like Spotify in the sense that it keeps practically all the money for itself, and you're effectively content providers who are doing it for stuff and giggles rather than as a business.
Good euphemism there at the end, Kieran. We've got a YouTube channel, have we? I really should pay more attention in meetings, shouldn't I? What we could do to generate traffic is record some of the things we say before and after the pod. That would get.
Yeah. But I think the libel claims might outweigh any financial benefits.
Well, I'm sure you can do a spreadsheet that indicates the potential cost of lawsuits against the potential income of what we actually talk about. I nearly named a football club with a person in it, but I realised that would be a terrible, terrible mistake. But anybody who's been to any of our live shows recently will know exactly which person and which club I'm talking about. Our penultimate question, Kieran, comes from Fernando Jorge. And I'm assuming that because the first name is Fernando, Jorge is how you pronounce the second name. And I apologise, Fernando, if that's an assumption. Please let me know if I was incorrect. Fernando says, as a long-suffering Spurs season ticket holder, and on behalf of thousands of our listeners, Fernando, I'm going to take exception to that phrase, long-suffering Spurs season ticket holder. You haven't had a good couple of weeks, but I think there are many fans of many clubs who would happily swap their situation for yours. As a long-suffering Spurs season ticket, I love the expression. I'm working with one of the producers of I Got News for You is a Spurs fan, and you could tell he's a Spurs fan just by looking. He might as well have the word Spursy tattooed on his forehead. He's reached a situation where he doesn't celebrate. Yeah, most of us don't celebrate in case VAR knocks it off. He doesn't celebrate when Tottenham score because he knows inevitably that in the last 10 minutes of the game, the opposition will score two more. But Fernando says, as a long-suffering Spurs season ticket holder whose club is financially run properly, in inverted commas, Daniel Levy even recently said in the Spurs documentary on the Spurs website that all the money which is brought into the club from their non-footballing events, for example, Beyonce, Lady Gaga concerts, NFL, rugby matches, and now Formula One go-karting, will be reinvested into the Spurs team on players that are affordable. Therefore, based on current estimates, and hopefully Kieran will know what they are, will this generate enough money for Spurs to be able to challenge the big spenders such as Chelsea and Man United to buy elite players, and therefore make our team more competitive in the leagues and cups, which I think is basically another way of saying how much do Spurs make from the extracurricular activities, and will it be enough to buy a new defender?
Well, the answer is, Fernando, probably. And the reason why I say that, if we go back to 2016, in 2015-16, which was one of the final years that Spurs were playing at the old White Hart Lane as opposed to the new White Hart Lane, they were making £140 million less than Arsenal and £120 million less than Chelsea. If we fast forward to 2022, that £140 million deficit behind Arsenal has now been reversed, and they're now making £70 million a year more. So that has made them more competitive. The £120 million deficit behind Chelsea has been reduced to 37. So that there's no doubt that the strategy has been very successful in terms of bringing more money in. And benchmarking Spurs against other London clubs, I think we could be in a situation, especially in a year if Spurs are competing in Europe and Chelsea aren't, then Spurs could become the biggest earners in London. So that's a positive. You've also got to benchmark against the two Manchester clubs and Liverpool, and those three clubs have all done very well in recent years, because I think in the case of Liverpool and Manchester United, in my view, those are the two biggest brands as far as the Premier League is concerned, and their ability to extract money on an international and global market perspective is far higher than that of Spurs. And this isn't a snide comment. They've won trophies. And you've got this sort of this chicken and egg position. You can be big in terms of attracting sponsors if you've won trophies, but in order to win trophies, you need the money from the sponsors and the other parties to make you more competitive. So there is a sort of a natural barrier to that. But without the move to the new stadium and the strategy of Daniel Levy, I think Spurs would have been significantly behind those clubs. Manchester City, again, they've won lots of trophies. They've got lots of bonuses. They're expanding their stadium again. It's going to be tough for Spurs to catch up with them because they've got a different business model in terms of their financial backers and so on. So my view is that without the move to the stadium, I think Spurs would have been less successful than they are. Yes, okay, we have it. It's all good for a bit of a snigger because to go in front in 5 consecutive matches and get 1 point out of 15 on the back of that isn't great from anybody's perspective, but they are as competitive as they are on the back of Daniel Levy's strategy. Is that enough to make them trophy winners? Well, it helps. You've only got to look at Villa, and the way that they're playing. And I say they're in a broadly similar position, and they certainly generate a lot less money than Spurs themselves. So it can be done. You get the right coach. If you avoid injuries, Villa haven't had the same injuries that Spurs have had in recent weeks, and so
on. I think Villa are a good outside bet to win the title, Kieran. And if they can avoid injuries the way they did, I think when they won it back in the day last time, I think they only used 13 players, didn't they? Not the whole.
That's right.
That classic team with Gary Shaw on it.
Tony Morley and Gary Shaw, Peter With, Dennis Mortimer. Yeah, you can. Thing is, you can name that. You can name that squad as well.
Yeah,
or rather, we can.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean,
younger than us listening to the show.
Gary Shaw is a great favourite because you've met Gaz, one of my closest mates, and the reason he's called Gaz, that's his nickname, is because he looks nothing like Gary Shaw. That's that's how nicknames develop over the time. It's just, somebody pointed out many years ago how different he looked to Gary Shaw, and he became Gary Shaw, and then Gaz, and he still answers to it now. His real name is Andrew, which is although his workmates called him Stan, which is all very confusing. Which is lovely because our last question indeed, comes from Andrew Woodman. Although anyone with the name Andrew Woodman, it's very difficult not to say Andy Woodman, who's one of my favourite goalkeepers, mainly because he looks like a goalkeeper should look. He looks like the way every goalkeeper looked in 80s Sunday League teams, just slightly overweight and in goal because he wasn't quite good enough to be out on the pitch. Also Gareth Southgate's best mate, I believe, Andy Woodman. But anyway, Palace legend, if he'd played more than 3 games for us. Ho, 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 gentlemen. Get ready to jingle and deck your balls this holiday with the help from our friends over at Manscaped. The leaders in below-the-waist grooming have just launched their Performance Package 5.0 Ultra. Let your ornaments shine and enjoy 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com with the code price of football, all in big letters.
The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra is the one-stop shop for holiday gifting perfection. It includes a trimmer as precise as Santa coming down the chimney. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra brings 2 next-gen blade heads, which are perfect for sculpting your holiday do. You can also say goodbye to those holiday party crashers. Nose and ear hairs. The Weed Whacker 2.0 ear and nose hair trimmer is the king of trimming those hairs trying to sneak into your festivities uninvited.
So if you want the smoothest sprouts in town this Christmas and the shiniest baubles, get 20% off and free shipping with the code priceoffootball at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com and use the code priceoffootball. Give the gift of Manscaped this holiday season. Andrew Woodman has a really interesting question, Kieran, to end with. He says, with the elite player performance plan allowing players from the EFL to be poached for pennies by clubs in the Premier League, what are the arrangements for clubs who have been relegated from the Premier League? Could, for instance, Liverpool go and raid Everton's academy should they be relegated? Or is there a period of grace? Now, I think it's worth, Kieran, if you can, because the EPPP is an acronym that gets thrown around a lot without people really fully understanding what it actually is. So perhaps for some of our newer listeners, you could give a brief summary of the elite player performance plan and why people like Andrew think it allows EFL players to be poached for pennies.
Right. The elite player performance plan was introduced in order to improve the number of local qualified players that made it through to the top level of football. Yeah, that was the argument that was put forward. And what it did is that it introduced a 4-tier system into the coaching of academy players and the development and the education of academy players. But it also scrapped what was known as the 90-minute rule. And the 90-minute rule meant that a club could only recruit players who were in a 90-minute radius of the training facilities of that club. So therefore, Liverpool and Manchester United couldn't go down to London, Chelsea couldn't go and pick up players from Exeter, and so on. And what the Premier League did, because it was very much developed by the Premier League, the Premier League said to the EFL, we think this is a really good idea, and if you don't agree to it, we will take away your funding that we give you in the form of solidarity payments. So solidarity payments have been introduced. EFL clubs get a proportion of the Premier League TV deal, and it's actually worth more than the EFL's own TV deal. So I think under the solidarity payments, a club will get around about £4.5 to £5 million a season in the Championship, 400,000 to 500,000 in League Two, and they introduced that, and then they said, "Oh, it's we're doing this out of the generosity of our hearts, and if you, by the way, we might take it away if you don't vote in respect of EPPP." So, which seems a bit strange because if EPPP is as good as people say, you would have thought that Championship and other EFL clubs would vote for it, but what it also means is that a club who has got a Category 1 academy can go to any academy player anywhere in the country, and for a fixed fee, they can take that player from the age of 9, 10, whatever it's going to be, and they can transfer them that to a academy. So you could have a promising 10-year-old, and for £3,000, they now become part of Chelsea or Manchester City or Liverpool, wherever it's going to be. And this has resulted in a lot of resentment from the smaller clubs. We've seen some academies fold. We've seen some academies being replaced by B teams. And the fees are fixed in terms of how many years have you been at the academy, and then should that player, when or if they turn professional, should that player play in the first team, then you get a fixed amount of compensation for every 10 matches, the most amount that you can play. So if Palace have got a promising player who at the age of 10 or 11 or even 14 or 15 goes to a Premier League club, another Premier League club, they get a few thousand, it'd be sort of tens of thousands compensation at that age. And if that player goes on to play 100 games in the Premier League, and let's face it, you have to be pretty decent to do that, Crystal Palace would get £1.3 million in compensation for that player's development. So, some people say that that's harsh. So it's not actually linked to the division you're in. So, should the worst happen to Everton won't get relegated, in my view, regardless of the penalty. We've had this discussion. If provided they maintain their Category 1 academy, it's up to the player to choose. The predators can't bully the player into joining, although, as we both know, quite a few of them are incentivised, or their parents are incentivised, and that's as often by agents and other unscrupulous individuals as for the player themselves. As far as why is it so closely linked to the Premier League, it's because the running costs can be quite high. The running costs are a minimum of £2.5 million to run a Category 1 academy. Now, I happen to know an academy manager of a non-Premier League club who's got a Category 1 academy, and they say their stated budget is £6 million a year, which is pretty generous. But they only actually get 2 because academy costs are exempt from FFP, and he says the bloody accountants, they're shifting stuff around. So that's where we are. So there isn't a sort of a period of grace or a raiding opportunity. There is still a lot of bad feeling from smaller clubs towards the clubs who are Category 1, who are effectively factory farming. These fees haven't been index linked since EPP started, as far as I'm aware. And also, has it achieved its objective? Well, we've still got a 99.8% failure rate as far as academies are concerned in developing players that come through to first teams. And I was listening to a talk by somebody who sort of has been involved in academy and youth football, and he says it is still a stain on the game, in the sense that if you take a look at the educational attainment of kids who are coming into academies, overall they join at the age of 9 and 10, and they've got above average educational achievements to date. And when they leave, overall, they've got below the national average. So what is happening during the period that they are academy players? It's a very competitive industry. Because if there's 25 of you in the academy, the chances are that one of you has got a 50-50 chance of making it. The other 24 probably not. And also, it's a terrible thing to say. We know that clubs deliberately keep these, a large number of these kids on who they know are not going to make the grade, simply because you need your best kid. You need dummies to run rounds, and you need people to tackle and people to be in the drills with your prospective star. So the clubs cynically are keeping kids there who've got no chance of developing. Their educational future is being compromised, and therefore, in my view, it's an area which needs proper addressing, but it will never happen. And from the kids' point of view, they all want to play football. They want to play first team football. They make sacrifices in terms of their education. They make sacrifices in terms of their social groups, because they don't go out with their mates. They're not developing as individuals, and then they get kicked out at the age of 15 and 16, and society on a broader level has to pick up the pieces.
Was that impression of your secret academy person an indicator as to where the academy is? Because if so, I'm going to say somewhere in the north. I can't be more precise than that, Kieran, because the accent wasn't more precise than that. Steve Parrish, the owner of my club, Crystal Palace, or one of the owners of my club, Crystal Palace, who runs the club, was very honest about the reason we spent so much money to become a Category 1 academy. We've got a remarkable academy down there in Beckham. It's beautiful facilities, but the reason we did it was so we could become one of the predators rather than one of the clubs that were having players taken away, that we can now scour the country for young people to come to us and not get a chance to play first team football under Roy Hodgson. So, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. What you said, though, Kieran, Tony Pulis, who I think would be happy to be described as old school, somebody commissioned Tony Pulis to do a report on the academy system. And he, as you say, he was very scathing about, in particular, and I know this means a lot to you, Kieran, because you are an educator, a very good educator as well. But Tony Pulis was the one to point out that shocking statistic that kids come out of the academy system less intelligent than they went in somehow. And also he made some recommendations for changes to EPPP, regionalisation, etc., which are all so sensible. There's no chance of them being implemented. But the academy system is something that needs looking into, Kieran, because as you always point out, these are young human beings we're talking about here. And it's very easy for us to go, oh, well, 99.8% of them don't make it. But that's a lot of disappointment and despair and unhappiness that for the most part that still doesn't get properly dealt with. They're just basically sent back to the streets where they came from and told to get on with it. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. We appreciate every single one of you. If you'd like to join those people and make a small monthly contribution, you will also get access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. We've got a Christmas one coming up. You can find out all about that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you have a question you'd like answered the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. Kieran and I will be in Hastings on Wednesday in just 2 days' time for an event for East Sussex Libraries. We'll be talking about our new book, and we'll be talking to you, and you can probably ask Kieran behind your hand which football club and manager person I was talking about earlier. I'm afraid the tickets are sold out, but there is a waiting list, so you might be able to get one. If you want to put yourself on the waiting list, then click in the link in the show notes to register for that list. And if you'd like to buy our books or one of our other books, or get yourself a Price of Football t-shirt, you can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. We'll be back on Thursday with our regular news pod. In the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Well, thank you everybody for the support for the show and for the interaction and engagement that we get on so many levels from you. Rather than the traditional farewell, I just want to give a shout out to a friend of mine. I'm not going to name him. We will refer to him by the name Wigwam, because this is actually quite a sensitive subject.
Oh, okay.
He's a really good guy, and right. You know, some people you don't know that well, but the more you hear about them, the more impressed. Well, a few years ago, he and his partner, they decided that they were going to adopt 2 children who had been from difficult circumstances, and anybody that's prepared to do that, my hat is firmly doffed to them. And then he heard recently that the brother of the 2 children, a very young brother of the 2 children, has been rejected for adoption and fostering by the people who are going to look after him. And this child is a years old, and he's already got his hands full in what he's having to do to try to improve these children's lives. And he's decided this week that he's going to make up that family. He's going to take on this 3rd child, and I've just got nothing but admiration. You know, life's pretty depressing at present in so many levels. You think about it from political, economic, environmental, social, and so many levels, and it's just great to know that there are really good people out there doing really good things. So you know who you are, Wigwam. All I can say is that you're an absolute hero, and we need more people like you in this world.
I'm not going to speculate, Kieran, as to how Wigwam got his nickname. Possibly because he's quite intense. Who knows?
Hey!
Thank you. But I think we need to reassure ourselves, Kieran, in dark moments, that there are more Wigwams in the world than there are Farages, basically. There are more Wigwams than Bravermans. So, yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic story, Kieran, especially at this time of year. And if anybody out there can find a way of helping Wigwam, maybe donating some stuff, some baby, who knows, we'll happily send that in Wigwam's and his partner's direction. Foster parents, I think, Kieran, are up there for me with teachers and nurses. It's always very heartwarming when you hear foster children talk so lovingly of, because it's a full time. There are cynics, Kieran, who say, "Oh yeah, they get money for it," but it's more than if you can have something that's more than a full-time occupation. Being a foster parent is one of them, and taking a troubled stranger, because most of them are troubled, taking a troubled young person into your house and giving them warmth and comfort and stability is a fantastic thing to do. Hats off to all of them, and especially Wigwams. And on that note, we'll say goodbye. We'll see some of you in Hastings, and we'll see the rest of you next Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.